Ever wondered why gangsters never participate in knitting contests? Here's a tale that might tickle your funny bone. Picture this. Tony Two Toes, a notorious gangster known for his ruthless antics, was all set to pull off the heist of the century. The bank was scoped out, the plan was foolproof, the day was chosen. But life, as they say, has a funny way of knitting its own patterns. In a comedic twist of fate, Tony, due to a mix-up so laughably absurd, found himself not in front of the bank's vault, but in the middle of the town's biggest knitting competition. Picture the scene. Tony, a man more comfortable with a firearm than a pair of knitting needles, surrounded by grandmas and their balls of yarn. The confusion on his face was priceless, the situation hilariously ironic. And that's how Tony Two Toes, the feared gangster, became Tony Two Toes, the accidental knitter. So, how does a gangster fare in a knitting contest, you ask? Well, let's dive into the world of Tony, our unexpected knitting enthusiast. Picture this. Tony, a tough-as-nails gangster, sitting amidst a sea of pastel-colored yarn, armed with nothing but 2 knitting needles and a pattern that might as well be hieroglyphics. His first attempts are as hilarious as you'd imagine. Knitting needles flying everywhere, colorful yarn entangling him like a woolen spider's web. Tony's frustration is palpable, but there's a spark of determination in his eyes. Slowly but surely, Tony starts to get the hang of it. Each stitch becomes less of a battle and more of a rhythm. He starts to enjoy the process, the gentle click-clack of the needles, the softness of the yarn. The knitting contest that was once a source of comedy has now become a battlefield where Tony is determined to emerge victorious. And just like that, Tony was knitting like a grandma on a Sunday afternoon, determined to take home the blue ribbon. But can a gangster become a knitting champion, you ask? Well, prepare to have your mind blown. Picture this. Tony Two Toes, a hardened gangster who's more accustomed to threatening rivals than threading needles, is on the stage. His face is etched with concentration, his beefy fingers deftly maneuvering the knitting needles with a finesse you'd never expect. And then, the unexpected happens. He finishes his piece. It's not the prettiest, not by a long shot. It resembles a mob boss's tie more than a delicate scarf. But it's complete, and it's unique. The audience gasps, the judges exchange looks of disbelief, and then applause. Thunderous applause echoing through the hall. Tony, with his unconventional knitting techniques, has just pulled off the impossible. The crowd roars, "Tony! Tony!" as he lifts the grand prize. The gangster, who once instilled fear in the hearts of many, is now the proud reigning champion of the local knitting contest. Who would have thought? Tony Two Toes, the gangster, now the reigning champion of the local knitting contest. So, what happens when a gangster wins a knitting contest? Well, let's just say the aftermath is as colorful as the yarn Tony Two Toes used to knit his way to victory. His gangster pals, once skeptical, now find themselves in awe of Tony's newfound talent. They watch him, slack-jawed and wide-eyed, as he knits intricate patterns with a speed and finesse that would put any grandma to shame. Meanwhile, the knitting community is in an uproar. Who would have thought that a hardened gangster could produce such delicate, beautiful work? And yet, here we are. Tony has become an unlikely icon, bridging the gap between the underworld and the knitting circle. And Tony? He's taken his victory in stride. He's found a way to incorporate knitting into his everyday gangster routine. Bulletproof vests? He knits them. Disguise masks? He knits them. He's not just Tony Two Toes, the feared gangster anymore. He's Tony Two Toes, the knitting champion. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of how Tony Two Toes, the feared gangster, became Tony Two Toes, the knitting champion. Who knew gangsters had such a soft spot for knitting?